Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Adobe Senior Creative Director, Adam Morgan.
Nope. There we go. Oh, we're there. Okay. Well, welcome to Return on Ideas, the epic story of neuroscience, creativity, and ROI. So I'm going to ask for some audience participation a few times throughout this presentation. Let's start by asking this first question. Who here considers themselves a right-brainer, the creative type? Okay, good chunk. And what about the left-brainers out there? More analytical. Oh, fewer. Okay. All right, fair enough. That helps me. All right, so let's get a little agenda of what you're going to hear today. So I'm going to start about talking about the situation, of creativity, and what people how they put value on creativity. And then I'm going to go through and explain the neuroscience behind creativity and how it works. And then I'm going to give you some use cases, some real-life examples of how you can improve your marketing through creativity. But it starts out with a story. So before I worked at Adobe, I worked for 20 years in ad agency life, a variety of international agencies and small little creative boutiques. But one time, I had a client who was a regional bank, and my client was Russell Fisher, and I had gone and presented a series of billboard campaigns to him. And as he was looking through all the campaigns, the different ideas, he asked me a really interesting question that stuck with me. And he looked at him and he said, "Listen, Adam, I trust you. I know that you understand creativity, and you know that these ideas will work. But how do I go talk to my boss? He's a sales guy. He doesn't believe in creativity. He thinks marketing is all fluffy. So how can I go to him and prove to him that these creative billboards are going to work better than us just taking something and putting a straightforward message on there, put the logo on it, and call it good? What kind of ammo can you give me?" It was interesting because for me that hit home, because I went through all the classic answers of here's stickiness and standing out and all the great stories we've heard, but he was looking for a different type of answer. And just to level set, this is the question that he was really asking. And it's a question that's been with us since the 70s. Do creative ideas work better? And if you look back over history, and many of you have worked either in agency or on client side, it's been a dividing question. There are agencies that believe in creativity and agencies that believe in results. There are companies that believe in direct marketing and companies that believe in branding. And the way they've tried to prove one side or the other is better than the other is through case studies or financial assessments. And the funny thing is that I've seen the same case studies used for both sides to prove that one side is better than the other, right? So that method hasn't worked over the years. So we're really stuck with this question of how do we prove if creativity works? Or another question here at Adobe, we talk about it in terms of design. How do I prove the value of design? And before I get to where my journey and what this presentation is all about, let me give you a level set of, in the industry, how we've talked about answering this question. And it starts out with this classic pitch. And in my experience in many years, I've given this pitch to many clients, and many of you have probably heard this same pitch. But this is the explanation of how creative ideas get you to brand loyalty. And here's how it goes. First of all, your customers are being bombarded by millions and millions of messages. And the only way to stand out is to get noticed. And you do that by creating emotional ideas that are engaging, and we call this being sticky. And in order to be sticky, you have to be authentic and true to your brand, and then you'll be believed. And then next, as long as your messages ring true, then you'll be remembered. Or if your media budget's big enough, that'll also do the trick. And then finally, if you have enough exposure to these great messages, if you have positive experiences, then you'll reach brand preference. And finally, if you don't screw it up and you maintain the relationship, you'll reach brand or customer loyalty. And that's the classic pitch that we give everyone, and that's what we've been using of how creative ideas work and how they get you to loyalty. But let's go back to Russell's question, because his question really hit home for me. And he may not have thought about it much after that. He may have thought it was just a rhetorical question and went up to his boss and tried to sell the campaign. But for me, it became this quest over the next 7 years of how do I answer that? And how do I answer it in a meaningful way? And not just for creative people, but for the logical people who are, the salespeople, like Russell's boss. And so instead of using case studies, my presentation today is going to show you why creativity works. But I'm going to use neuroscience and decision-making. And certainly there are a lot of books out there on that topic, but I'm going to bring you I'm going to couch it in this unique lens of creative marketing. So how do we use neuroscience and biology and the study of decision-making for creative marketing? All right, so the one thing I do want to clear up is when I talk about creative ideas, what I'm really talking about are emotional ideas. Because creativity is really about eliciting strong emotions, right? It's not about straightforward messaging. It's about emotions. If you heard all the great stuff on main stage earlier, where we were talking about emotions and how important those are in experiences, that's what I'm talking about. All right, and if we answer Russell's question of do creative ideas work better, there's a lot of other marketing questions that we can answer. Like, how do I prove the value of design? How do I make my brand stand out? Why is retention easier than acquisition? How do I keep my brand voice consistent? And how can I make better marketing decisions? So we'll get to all of these in a little while. But first, I'm going to start out talking about the neuroscience and how the brain works. And I'm going to try and change up a few of the common myths we have about the brain. And I don't think there are any neuroscientists out there. I checked the log beforehand, so I think we're good. But if you are, you may, this is pretty simple stuff, so don't get too up in my grill. All right. I started out introducing myself as a central brainer. And no, that doesn't mean that I have a third brain wedged between my two hemispheres. What it means is I've had an interesting career where I've been a creative writer for a long time, but I've also been a logical strategist. And really, we all understand the story of the two hemispheres, right? We have the left hemisphere, which is about denotation, which means the literal meaning of things. It helps us understand that. And the right side of our brain is all about connotation, or the connection between things. That's like when you're getting the punchline of a joke. That's connotation. But what we don't talk a lot about, at least in common terms, is the front and the back of the brain, not the right and the left. And the front and the back of the brain is actually really interesting when we're thinking of how we make decisions and how our brain works. Because the front of the brain, the frontal lobe, which is right behind your forehead, behind your eyebrows, is really what makes us unique as humans. We have an oversized brain compared to other animals, and in large part that's due to our frontal lobe, or the prefrontal cortex is what it's called in the industry, is the darling of the neuroscience industry. And this is really what makes us different, and it's what houses our executive function. Our executive function helps us to manage time, put off instant gratification for future rewards. It's really what gives us that rational thought. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through and break apart every little chunk of the brain and tell you what everything does. That's not what my point is here. I just want to point out a few of them. But it's important to understand that the brain is mapped into a lot of chunks, but really we don't know as much as we think we do. We have fMRI machines that measure blood flow, but that doesn't tell us everything, and there's still a lot of uncharted territory out there. What I want to do is for today, is just change your perspective a little bit, and not think about the right or the left, but think about the brain in terms of it's just a massive bunch of connected neurons, 86 billion according to recent estimates, and they're all just mixed together in our brain. And in fact, there are a lot of studies where if someone has a chunk of their brain that's hurt, or even, there's this one girl where half of her brain was taken out, and the other half started to learn some of the functionality that was supposed to be on the missing half. Or there are other people that have the corpus callosum either severed or they are born without one, and they can work almost like they have two independent brains, reading a book with two eyes and two different pages going at the same time. So the takeaway is that the brain is amazing, and there's a lot going on there, and it's a huge mess of neurons, but we need it all. We don't just use 10%, that myth is not true, but you need the whole noodle. All right, so now that we have description of parts covered, let's get into this relationship. And it's the classic story of logic versus emotion. And I first want to start out with just asking an introspective question. So I want you to all think about this personally and come up with an answer. And it's this. Realistically, do you place more value on logic or emotion? And historically, the answer has been logic, right? This goes all the way back to Descartes, where we had the little charioteer that was driving our animal instinct, and it's all about suppressing emotions, keeping them in control. And some of us, if you really think hard about it, I had some people in my experience, that if we suddenly started talking about strategy, this one would say, let's just slow down and really think about it. And that's what we're all about, right? If we just slow down and really focus, and we're really rational, that's when we're going to make great decisions, right? And we just need to control those emotions. And you think even throughout history, it's also a part of our school system. That's exactly, we test with logical, tests and logical way of studying. And even in marketing, there's the thought that rational strategy is best. If we can just slow down and really think about it, that's when we're going to make the best marketing decisions. Even the way we test ideas is that way, through multiple choice answers. All right, so let's understand the relationship between logic and emotion a little bit better. And it's going to start with another story. So any classic neuroscience book, if you've read them, starts out with, or at least includes this story of this fine gentleman, Phineas Gage. It was 1848 in Cavendish, Vermont, and he ran a railroad crew where they were laying track through the mountains. And whenever they'd come across a big chunk of rock, what they'd do is they'd drill a hole, fill it full of black powder, tamp it down with a tamping iron, which is one of the object he's holding in his hand right there, and then they'd walk away a little bit and blow it up, right? That was how they did it. Unfortunately, as Phineas was tamping down one of the holes, the rod hit the side of the rock, caused a little spark, and blew up in his face. And that rod was shot through the air, went up underneath his chin, through his eye, and out the top of his brain. And it blew a big chunk of his brain out. But here was the amazing part. He didn't die. When the doctor showed up, when people were helping him, he was still conscious through the whole ordeal. But the interesting thing that happened is after that episode, Phineas was never the same. He was logical and very, he could have a conversation with you. It's like nothing really changed as far as him being a human, but his personality changed. He used to be a great, upstanding gentleman, the foreman of a crew, very reliable, and he changed, and it was all about, he was kind of a villain, a skinflint. He was just a naughty guy, and no one liked hanging out with him. And we really didn't know what's going on. There's a lot of speculation about, this case study, but it wasn't until later, in the mid-90s, when a doctor, Antonio Damasio, figured out what had happened. And Dr. Damasio worked with a lot of other patients who had had the same part of their brain either damaged or due to cancer it was removed or whatever the problem was. And he worked with all these patients to try and figure out what would happen, because it would be the same thing with his patients. They would be very logical and talk to you, but they had problems, and then you could tell there was something wrong. And what he found out is that the area of the brain that was removed or damaged is the area that controls emotion. And he would try simple tests with these patients. He would say, let's just set up an appointment when's the next time you want to set up an appointment? And all these patients would, analyze and analyze. It's as if they started from square one every single time. They'd say, well, Thursdays are great, but then I always, I have to drive over here, so maybe Wednesdays are better. And it was like they would deliberate and deliberate logically, trying to make a decision for hours. And they could not make a simple decision. And what he understood from all of these tests, because he would test them more than just asking the questions, is that a brain that can't feel can't make a decision. That was the insight. A brain that can't feel can't make a decision. And we'll get back to that in a minute, and you'll understand why we need emotions in order to make a decision. All right, there was another study done by Cosmides and Tooby, and it was called Evolutionary Psychology, a primer. And what they wanted to find out is, if you go back to that Descartes thing where animal instinct is evil and we got to drive it and control it, and they really wanted to find out what made the difference between us and animals. And what they found out was actually the opposite, because it wasn't instinct, it wasn't all of these emotions that made us, animals. It wasn't our logic, our big prefrontal cortex that made us human. It was actually emotions that made us human. Our ability to love, our ability to fear disease, any of those types of things. The animals didn't do that, but we did, and that's what made us different. So in essence, our superiority over animals isn't our logical brain, it's our emotions. All right, understanding that relationship between logic and emotion, let's get into the two systems of our brain. So there's common agreement right now through neuroscientists, psychologists, that there's really two different ways that we think. And we call these the two different systems. And many of them call it System A or System B. There's a lot of different terminology. I'm just going to call it your conscious and your subconscious, just because those are words that we use in our vernacular. So of these two systems, the first system, your conscious system, is slow, cognitive, and rational. And your subconscious is fast, automatic, and emotional. And some of you are probably saying, no, hold on, my conscious brain, the one that I'm aware of, that's the fast one. I'm lightning fast. I mean, I crack jokes like no tomorrow. I'm thinking of some certain people in the audience there. But anyhow, it's really not. Your fast system is your automatic and emotional system, and your slow system is your logical system. And let's talk about it a little bit more. So if you think about it, most of the thinking that happens in our brain, most of the real thinking is under the hood. It's under the iceberg. Imagine if I had to consciously make myself move, every ligament, every muscle in my legs, keeping myself upright, or even more than that, if I had to make myself breathe in and out every single time, if I were trying to focus on all of that with conscious brain, I would go crazy. It wouldn't work. Only the lightweight stuff, like philosophy or rocket science, that's the kind of stuff that our conscious brain can handle because it doesn't kill us, right? All the heavy lifting, the stuff that keeps us alive, is handled by our subconscious. And that was the wrong button. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about these two systems. Our conscious brain, there's a study done by, a famous one by George A. Miller, called A Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2, Some Limits on Our Capacity for Processing Information. Rolls right off the tongue. Amazing, amazing read if you ever want to get into it. But even more currently, there was a study done by University of Missouri, and they put it closer to 3 to 5 chunks of data is what your conscious brain can handle at any given time. I know a lot of us, we've heard, at first we thought we could multitask like crazy, and then we have all these studies that prove that we really can't multitask that much. Our conscious brain can only focus on a few variables. But let's talk about the subconscious. A recent study from the Salk Institute put the estimate closer to the amount of data that is in the entire internet. And if you think about, there's stats of, in the last 4 years or so, 90% of our data has been created. But every single one of you is carrying around enough capacity to hold the entire internet. Think of every tweet, every website, every YouTube video, and even the entire voiceover track of Zombo.com is held inside your brain. So the key takeaway, logic is limited, emotion is vast and fast. You may not believe me. Let's do a little test. So everyone get comfortable in your chairs. I'm going to give you a few tests, and you can see for yourself your fast and your slow system in action. All right? So first, we're going to start with your slow system. I'm going to give you a little problem to solve here really quickly. But because it's slow, I'll give you a little bit longer. All right, let me go on to another test of your slow system. This is a famous test called the +1. So in labs, they'll have people memorize a string of numbers and then add 1 digit to each of these numbers. So the 4 becomes a 5 and so on. I'll put it in chunks of smaller 3 to 4 chunks so it's easier. So memorize that number. All right, now I want you in your mind to add 1 digit to each of those numbers. All right, I'm looking around. Chances are most of you just said, oh, that's too hard, and you just dropped it, didn't even try, right? Who even tried? Okay. So here's what happens in labs when they do these tests. What happens is your pupils dilate, you try to shut out everything else, and you really, really focus. Your hands sweat, and you're really putting a lot of energy into your prefrontal cortex. You're really trying to solve that problem. That's your slow system in action. All right, now let's move on to your fast system. This is a little easier test. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple images or words, and I want you to really think through, as you see those words, pay close attention to what's being communicated to you, right? What are past experiences or things that you can feel? And focus on your feelings and see how quickly information is communicated to you. All right, I'm seeing some nodding heads. Chances are if you have a relationship with this brand, with Disney, maybe you're thinking about the last time you took your kids to the park or some movies that you grew up watching. Instantly, there's a lot of memories that are communicated to you. Let's try another one. All right, some of you may just be thinking, oh, I'm thirsty, right? But for others, this morning nectar or afternoon nectar or all-day nectar, whatever it may be, there's a lot of meaning in that brand. But that's not as universal. Let's try one more that's a little more universal that everyone can hopefully have a connection with. All right, hopefully you got the idea. Many of us have a lot of fond memories. A lot of things were communicated instantly in that quick little hit of emotion. That's your fast system in action. All right, let's talk about how we make decisions. All right, so we understand the two systems. Now let's talk about how they relate to each other in making decisions. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you're driving home. You get out of work, you go get in your car, you turn on the keys, and you start driving. And then suddenly you're home. We call this going on autopilot. And many of you have experienced that, right? Hopefully some of you. And you don't know how it happened, and suddenly you're there, but you're like, how did I not even pay attention? I could have killed myself or someone else. It's really scary, whatever. But let's say you're driving home, and you're maybe on autopilot, and suddenly you see an accident on the side of the road. There's an ambulance, a fire truck, a crumpled up hood, and life seems to slow down as you're passing by, and you rubberneck as hard as you can, and you get like a split second just to see the accident and the carnage, but you can't help yourself from just slowing down and really focusing on that. That's really like our two different systems in action. And let's talk about that a little bit more. Because really, the way the brain works is by predicting with the subconscious, right? Think of all the amount of data that your brain takes in. I mean, we talked about in the beginning on that pitch how there's millions of messages out there. But in reality, think of how much your brain is taking in every second. Of all your input devices, your five senses, let's take sight just for an example. In reality, we may think that we see this big picture, but our vision is only showing a small little portion of what our visual cortexes are getting in front of us. Everything else all around the edges is being predicted and programmed from your subconscious, right? We're not getting all that much input. And this is really important because as they've looked at the brain, there are more dendrites flowing from the point of emotion to the point of rationality. And what I mean by that is there's more predicting power pushing forward rather than inputs going back to the subconscious. So it's not like we're just soaking in everything around us. That's just impossible. There's just too much of it out there. It's all about predicting. And there was a neuroscientist I interviewed once, and he had this awesome quote. And he said, when our brain is doing its job at predicting our surroundings, our subconscious is in control. Only when there's an error or something doesn't match our predicted reality does the conscious brain kick in. Only then do we become aware and notice the element that's different. So on the slide before where you saw that fish that was different, it's the anomaly. Our brains focus on anomalies, right? We're not just focused on everything. It's like the NSA. They can't listen to everything, I hope. They have to focus on certain things. I mean, they've got budget limitations, right? That's what we hope. So that's the same way with our brain. We're trying to predict as much as we can and then take in as little as possible so that our brains can be efficient. And that's why when we're driving home, our subconscious brain automatically sees the stop sign, it engages our leg, and we slowly push on the brake, we come to a stop, and then we accelerate out of the stop, past the stop sign. It's just automatic because it's trying to predict and make it happen. All right, so let's talk about what happens in the brain when we make decisions. So the first thing that happens is when you encounter a new situation, the brain is going to do a cross-analysis in all of the folders and all the past experiences and see if you've experienced something before. Like, if I put my hand on fire, it's going to hurt, right? If I have that experience already locked in there, it'll just shoot me back an emotion and remind me of that memory. So when we find a match, we can get a flood of emotion. And the way we do that is through a special neuron called a spindle neuron. And this is a neuron that's unique to hominids, so humans and apes and a few others. And the difference between our spindle neurons and other neurons is that the spindle neuron is super long, and they're all wound around our whole brain and connected everywhere. And that way, if something happens, we can instantly flood a little bit of dopamine, like a small fluctuation in dopamine, which is just one of the neurochemicals in our brain, can be flooded instantly throughout the whole brain. It doesn't have to take a lot of time to get there because those spindle neurons are all connected. So even a small fluctuation gives us an instant alert. But what happens if there isn't a match? What if we go through our mental catalog and there's no match? Then what? Well, then we notify the little CEO in our brain, the prefrontal cortex. And then we go to our slow system, and we're going to process it, we're going to think about it, and then we're going to make a new memory. Once we've made this memory, we need to send the message back. So the executive order goes back to the subconscious, and the way we do it is through another emotional file. So those neurochemicals are really the glue that's pulling it all together. And the way our neurons communicate is through those neurochemicals like dopamine and serotonin, the things that make us happy, sad, all of our emotions. That's what neurochemicals are, our emotions. So this flood of neurochemicals between neurons is how we create memories. It's first we see an anomaly detection, and we add neurochemicals and emotions, and that's how we make memories. Not only in making memories, but emotion is critical in them and retrieving them. So it's just like ones and zeros in a hard drive. Like if any of you understand how we save memory onto a hard drive, it's just a bunch of ones and zeros. And that's the same thing in our brain. Think of all those interconnected neurons. What we're really doing is just firing a new path and different paths in our neurons so that we can lock in that information. So as those numbers, those ones and zeros are laid down, they really mean nothing until it's associated with an emotion. So those, what we call memory traces, are made with neurons firing in a row with emotion between them. That's the basics of it. It's just our biology. We use emotions and neurochemicals to lock in an emotion and retrieve them. So let's give another example. If emotions are so powerful, let's talk about how much emotion, or if there's more emotion, do we have stronger memories? And if any of you work in media, we've probably had the discussion of how many exposures does it take until a customer accepts a message? 3, 5? The truth is, it depends on the amount of emotion present. There are some really traumatic experiences that people only have once, and they'll remember it for the rest of their life. But if there's less emotion, there's less neurochemicals present, it may take repeated exposure. Let's give an example of this. So there's a famous story. It's called a 6-word story. Many of you may have heard this. It goes back 100 years or more. And I'm not going to get into who actually wrote it because that's controversial. But the story itself, baby shoes for sale, never worn. This story, when people have heard it, it doesn't take multiple exposures for you to remember this awesome story with only 6 words. And why is that? It's because it's packed with emotion. You empathize with these parents losing a child, what happened, they had to sell the shoes. Like that emotional moment is powerful enough that people don't forget this story. All right, so here's a really interesting thought. If emotions really are just a summary of all of our past decisions and our past memories, then really, emotion is logic, right? Emotions represent a massive amount of rational thought. Emotions are lots of logic, all summarized in an instant hit of emotion. So the next time you feel something, like when we saw those examples of looking at something, that's why it's communicating back a ton of past decisions, which is really interesting, right? It's no longer creativity versus logic. They're the same thing. That's like saying creativity and strategy. They're the same thing, just different expressions of it. All right, and here's a fun quote from Dr. Stevenson again. When making a decision and locking in a memory, emotions are everything. In neuroscience, there's another expression. Neurons that fire together, wire together. In other words, the more activity you have in a certain pathway, the more it becomes plastic. And that plasticity is mediated by certain neurotransmitters and chemicals, also known as the regulators of emotion. So when we make a decision, our brains are flooded with feeling. All right, so let's go back to that question that I asked in the beginning, and you answered it inside your own heads. But do you want to change the answer? Have I at least influenced any of you? So let me ask by a raise of hand, who thinks that there should be more emphasis placed on emotion? All right, great. Sorry, but the answer is both. It's really not. It's not emotion. We use both. And that's what's so funny about that whole battle is we need both, but it's finding out when's the right time to use logic and when is the right time to use emotion. Because we're human if we use both. So here's an easy rule of thumb. If you think about logic as the calculator, it's super useful, but only in certain situations. Or if emotion is like the latest laptop. So if ever you're making a decision that's easy, where there's only a couple of variables, right? Your logical system only holds a couple of variables, then absolutely use the calculator. Use your logic. But if you're in a situation where you have to make a very, very complex decision, and oftentimes we keep thinking, oh, I got to just control that emotion. I don't want to make an emotional decision. The truth is, there are times when an emotional decision is the most appropriate way to go. Use all of that past experience. That's why sometimes when people make a decision by buying a car or house, they can just feel it's right. And they don't understand it. It's because we're just processing it a lot faster in our subconscious, and that's your body trying to tell you, yes, there's a lot of reasons why, and we've calculated it for you. So keep that in mind when you're making decisions. And what I'm saying through this whole presentation, I'm not saying that emotions are more important than logic. That's not it at all. What I am saying is there should be an equal seat at the table. There should be creative and strategy, brand and direct, art and science, right and left. Because it's important to have both elements present. But more often than not, what happens is in our world of logic, as marketers, as strategists, we push out the emotion and just try and focus on the logic, right? So when business decision makers think that emotional messaging is fluffy, like Russell's boss, they don't understand how humans think. So if you want to avoid risk, look at our biology. If you want a sure bet on your marketing dollars, you need to embrace a balance of both. And far too often, emotion is just seen as fluffy and not accepted. So that's my goal, is to let you understand both of these things are important and they both need an equal seat at the table. All right, here's another thing that makes me laugh a lot. How many of you have seen articles like, the marketing gut is dead, we have data-driven marketing, hallelujah, everything's saved. In fact, I had an interesting conversation on LinkedIn a few weeks ago. Some guy got on there and said, oh yeah, we don't need all that emotional, creative stuff. We've got this, and he put a link to an analytics company, some small little analytics startup. And I'm just laughing thinking, well, I work at Adobe, the largest analytics company in the country, and we still understand that there's a balance between the two. Data-driven marketing doesn't do away with emotion. It doesn't do away with creativity. It's the opposite. Data informs our ideas. It helps us make better ideas. It gives us those insights and brings us closer to making a great connection or a great creative idea. So the question is the marketing gut? Should we, what is the marketing gut? It's really just all those past experiences, past tests and studies and decisions and failures and successes, all rolled into one little sandwich wedged right here in our guts. So should we throw that away? Absolutely not. Use all the data you have. Use the outside data, use your website data, but don't forget about the data you already have inside. I would say use all sources. All right, now that we've gone through neuromarketing and how decisions are made and all those neurochemicals and synapses and all those things firing, let's talk about what this means to marketing. We're going to do some real-world examples of how you can put this into action. So remember those questions we talked about in the beginning? We're going to answer those 5 questions, and there's a lot more. So let's go back first to that neuroscience pitch that we looked at in the beginning, or sorry, the standard pitch. And I'm going to go through that same pitch, but this time with the benefit of neuroscience to explain what's really happening. Because it's so funny, in the past we don't know what's going on, but we know what works, and we can't really explain it. So we're going to explain it to you. All right, so the first step was getting noticed, right? And how do we do that? There's a million messages bombarding us. But when you really look back at how the brain processes it, we have all these conversations about how long should content be? Or we only have attention span of 3 seconds, now it's 2.5 seconds, or maybe it was 5 seconds on a website, so you got to capture attention fast. If you look back at how the brain works, it's about anomalies and emotion. Does the length of time matter? How fast can the brain process? In milliseconds. So length doesn't matter. What you should focus on, what's the anomaly, what's the emotion? All right, so if you do, here's 3 scenarios of what could happen when you're trying to get noticed. The first is, you have nothing. You've got a boring message that's just out there, and it goes completely under the radar. Nothing is lighting up in the brain. Now let's say you're Russell's boss, and you say, just put a straightforward message, it's just one of our capabilities, one of our benefits up on there, and we're good. But if it's just a straightforward message that doesn't do much, it may only hit the prefrontal cortex, a little bit of the slow system will kick in, and that's it. Or the better option of all 3, what if you create the right experience? You create an emotional and logical experience that lights up the whole brain and engages your audience. That's the way to go. Next, stickiness. So 2 years ago at Summit, there was another scientist, Dr. Simon, who talked about how with all this data coming in, we can't hold on to all of it, but we can only hold on to 10% of it, so we retain a smaller amount of it. So how do we make sure that we're giving them the right 10%, the right stuff that's going to be sticky? And the answer to that is think back of how it all works. The more brain activity, the more neurochemicals present, the more emotions, the more neurons that are trained, you have a greater chance of being sticky. In fact, if anyone's read the book, Made to Stick, it's interesting if you go through their 6 little qualities of what makes something sticky, a lot of them are very emotionally charged things. The next step, being liked. This one's interesting. So there was a book written by Eric Duplessis called The Advertised Mind. And he went out and they took thousands of marketing messages and advertisements and they tested people to try and come up with what's the one variable that matters the most. They thought it may be like media length, the 30-second commercial, a 10-second commercial, or is it the number of exposures? And what they found is far and above, the one thing that mattered more than anything else by far is likability. So if you go back to when we're saying, here's how we're locking in memories, and it's all just ones and zeros until you add a positive emotion to it, then that tells us lock in a memory with a positive emotion, and that's how you're going to reach likability. Look for positive emotions in your messaging, and that's how you'll be liked. Next, how are we remembered? So once you've locked in a memory, this is all about memory retrieval. So it's interesting. It's the same way as locking it in. The more emotion we have when we made the memory, and also the more emotion we have when we're pulling out a memory, it gives us a greater chance of retrieval. This is really interesting when we start talking about retention versus acquisition. This makes more sense now as why retention is easier, because there's already all those paths. There's all that emotion that was present when all those things were created. Think back to main stage when the NBA commercials were playing. And we saw, when the kid going through his life cycle of trying to grow up to become an NBA star, right? Even then, what we're doing is playing off of past experiences, past emotional cachet, right? We're just using all that stuff about nostalgia and the family, and then we're adding a little bit of a spin and now putting it towards NBA, and that's how we're using retention rather than acquisition. So it's an easier move than starting from scratch. Imagine if you're starting from scratch, you got to go through the whole laborious process of lighting up the prefrontal cortex, the CEO makes a decision, you slow down, we lock it back in with a new memory. That's a lot more work, and that makes sense why using strategies of retention is so much easier and more powerful. But that doesn't mean we can't go after acquisition. We just need to use some of our inherent memories and emotion to do it, and that's how you're remembered. Next, loyalty. All right, so if we think about it, if there are more traces burned into memory, more chances, more tracks laid down, more emotions, that gives us a greater chance of long-term plasticity. In other words, trust and loyalty. So it's a matter of repeating those processes and keeping it going, and that's how you get loyalty. So it's not like I was explaining some new program. It's the same steps. It's just interesting when you look at it from the lens of neuroscience, what's happening in the brain and how it's done. All right, let's go on to the next topic, a creative brand voice, or a straightforward one. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but in a large organization, there are a lot of marketers, there are a lot of opinions, and people always, if we don't do anything about it, you're going to have a fractured brand. You're going to have some people talking in one voice and another group talking in a separate voice. And if you looked at yesterday's main stage, we talked about it's important in experiences to have a singular voice. And that's really important to us also at Adobe. But it's hard especially when there are multiple audiences that your brand is talking to. And what I often see is someone says, oh, well, I'm talking to an IT director, or I'm talking to a developer, and therefore I need to be very logical and straightforward. But if I'm talking to like a creative director or a creative guy, then I can be zany and have fun and have a different personality. And the answer is no, you should really have one voice. But what we've come up with at Adobe, and this is kind of an eye chart, so I'll explain a little bit of what you're looking at here, is if you think of the brand voice, so we're talking about voice and tone. The voice is your brand personality. That's who you are, what you stand for, your values and beliefs. But your tone is a separate thing. If you were a personality and you're at a cocktail party, you may be the same person, but one time you're laughing and enjoying, and then another moment you may be more somber and talking in a hushed voice. Your tone can change. You can have mood swings. That's okay. It's as long as you keep your voice solid and your tone can change. And so we created this tone hierarchy. If you look on the left, we go level 1 through level 5. If you think about it in terms of a funnel, the left side is the top of funnel, and the right side is the bottom of funnel. So your immediate experiences, the first things you see are going to be level 1s. And then the last thing you see, as you've gone through all this experience, you've gotten deeper in the experience, that's a level 5. And this is really based on those two systems, right? Your fast system is going to understand something a lot quicker. Getting at those emotions, making a quick connection is way more important than trying to give a rational argument in the beginning. So we've made this tone hierarchy based on those two systems. So top of funnel, let's use emotion. As we get deeper in the experience, we use more logic. And we can blend that perfectly throughout the whole experience. So when you're at level 3, it's a little bit in the between. It's conversational. We have a little bit of technical details, but it's still story. Whereas if you get to a level 5, that's a call to action that should be straightforward and punchy. We shouldn't be getting cutesy and fancy with the spices. Let me show you a few examples of this in action. Here's an email. If you're looking at an email, then I would say the headline, which is the first thing you see, or maybe the image, that's going to be a level 1. That should be a lot more emotional, thought-provoking, and engaging. But as I get down to that button, that's a level 5. That CTA can just say, get the paper. I don't have to try and be super creative. And why this is important is because, I don't know about you, but for me, there's always been a battle over messaging. Someone wants the headline to be straightforward, someone wants the headline to be creative, and we're always fighting. But by creating this system, it's reduced the amount of conflict, and that way we can start to talk about what's the right emotion and what's the right logic, and let's put them in the right spots. Let me give you another example. Here's a website. If we're talking about the whole web experience, your top, homepage, that should certainly be more emotional and thought-provoking. You should go for your fast system and use emotional and engaging experiences. But as I get through product pages and all the way down to benefits and feature pages, I can probably be a little more straightforward. My headlines don't, subheads don't have to be as fancy. They can just get the information that people are looking for. Because if they're that engaged, they're ready to start comparing things and get logical, right? But this is also true on just an individual page. Think of them as a whole experience and as individual experiences. So on one given page, I may be a little bit more of a level 1 up top, and as I get through the bottom of the page, the story and features start to come out more, and it's a little more logical. All right, so that's just an example of how we've used this neuroscience to help us have better messaging and understand it better as far as the battle between over-messaging. All right, let me give you one more example. How do we judge creative ideas? All right, let's set the scenario. Let's say you're in a pitch meeting or you're in a presentation. You're sitting in the conference room. Either your agency comes in or your creative team or someone is coming in to present some new designs. And as you're sitting there listening to designs, here's what normally happens. The decision maker is listening and listening, but really at the back of her head, there's a checklist. And she's going down, all right, I did number 1, hit 1, 3, and 5. I did number 2, hit all 5, done. That's the one. I did number 3, that was only 1 or 2. And it was so funny. We all laughed at it, right? But then we're like, oh, we'll never do that. Because whatever, that's just not right. If I think logically about it, that doesn't hit all of the buttons. And that's how we make decisions. Before I tell you a different way of thinking about that, let's talk about the creative process that went into making that idea. And if you talk to creative people, a lot of them don't know how it works. It's kind of this little Zen moment. But there are some similar patterns that a lot of creative people use to come up with ideas. And it starts like this. First, you have immersion. You're going to read the creative brief. You're going to look at all these ideas. You're going to go immerse yourself in that topic. And then you're going to start making as many connections as possible. You're going to try and come up with some ideas, bounce some ideas off someone else. It's all about making connections. And then you quit, and you walk away, and you go through an incubation period. Maybe you'll just sleep on it or just walk away from it. And then suddenly when you're not paying attention, you're just in the shower, all of a sudden, bam, eureka, your idea comes to you. So why does this work? Let's look at the neuroscience behind it. Really what's happening is you're starting out just like our brains do. All that data is coming in. You're loading as much data as you can. Then your conscious brain, you're trying to make some connections with the slow system, right? And then finally you walk away from it, and you think you're done and you're not thinking about it, but your brain is still going. Your subconscious is still flying through a million different connections and making different traces and all these kinds of things. And finally, when it's come up with a good enough answer, it'll serve it up to your CEO, and the next thing you know, bam, there's the idea. That's how it's working. That's the creative process. So let's go back, and let's say you're back in that conference room, and you're looking at some ideas, and here's an interesting way of tackling creative or decision-making over creative ideas. First of all, you should listen, and then it's fine to go through that mental checklist in your head. Do it. You got to have your slow system to go through and make sure that things are solid. If something is completely off, then of course you put the brakes on it. But usually that's where people stop, and here's where we should keep going. You've got to give yourself some time for your brain to incubate. You've got to tap into your subconscious. We call this intuitive thinking, and there's a lot of great leaders out there who have trained themselves to balance both logic and emotion in making decisions. And when you do it right, you'll end up with a better decision. Because truth be told, most marketing decisions aren't simple decisions. They're very complex. And so if you use that same scenario, in fact, there's some famous stories of some CEO of a company that says, all right, we're going to have a meeting, but we're not making any decisions. I want people to listen and soak it all in, and then I want you all to sleep on it, right? That's really important. If you're only in logic mode, you're missing out on a great opportunity. This is the same way with the way we test creative ideas. We send them out and we do a survey, logical, multiple choice questions. And people are only using their logical brain to answer those questions. Do they really understand it? There are some places that are using both a balance of logic and emotion to test people, and it's a much better process to find an answer because focus groups and other things have been broken for a long time. So let's use both parts of our brain, adopt an attitude of intuitive thinking, and that will give you better decisions. All right, this is a little bit terrible. If any of you have seen What About Bob, in the beginning when he first meets Bob, he walks over to his bookshelf and says, okay, there's a groundbreaking new book, and I want to read a quote from it, and it was his own book. It's a little cheesy, but I'm going to do the same here real quick. And just have a quote from my book, just because I felt like it tied up this whole presentation really well. And here's the quote. As we better understand how the mind uses emotion to function, it gives new insight into why emotional marketing campaigns are more successful. For decades, marketing pros have known that emotional messaging pulls better, but they couldn't explain why. They just felt it in their guts. Now that we know how the brain ingests data, how it uses emotion to process it, and how emotion plays a pivotal role in decision-making and creating memories, we have a universal answer that explains why emotional marketing is more effective. We no longer have to guess. We know why emotions are essential to making decisions. It's based on biology. If we remove emotion from the equation, the results are suboptimal. So the question becomes, why wouldn't you use strong emotions and creative ideas in your marketing? So let's get back to Russell's question in closing. Certainly I don't think he thought much about it afterwards. It was just another rhetorical question. But it sure made a big impact on me. It took me many, many years of research and books and studying to try and come up with a decent answer for him. And certainly my response in this presentation isn't the end. I'm sure there will be other studies that will help give us more insight into this topic. But I hope it gives you a core of an answer as to why creative ideas work. And it's funny, after all these years, I still haven't met back up with Russell to give him his answer, but I never forgot it. It just took me 7 years to answer him. All right, we have a little bit of time, I guess, for Q&A. If you want, you can email me. There's my personal email. You can get a copy of the deck from me. Also, we've recorded the session, so you can watch it later on the Summit website. Or even better, if you want more information on the book or some of my newsletters, some of my articles, you can go to returnonidea.com, sign up for the newsletter, or get on the list, so when I publish, you can find out more. Anyhow, there may be a microphone roaming around. Okay, let's ask some questions. Which one is it? And I hope I have answers.
It's an opinion question. Sorry.
Okay.
What is your favorite marketing campaign right now? The one that you think is doing this the best, using a
Right now? Boy, that's a tough question. I don't think I have a good answer. I mean, I think the examples, some of the ones we've seen earlier, like the NBA one, I think any of them that are going to use strong, strong emotions, and that's really hard because it's going to be different for every person. But I think the ones that speak to me emotionally, I mean, even over the last Super Bowl, there were a lot of really good emotional ads that pulled on our heartstrings. And here's the funny thing, in speaking of that, like what's the right or what's the best ad, I've had conversations with people, and once you understand this, it's no longer a battle of should it be emotional or not emotional, and that's not it. It's more about what's the right emotion. And I think there's an agency in London, they've changed their creative brief down to just one word, and it's one emotion. It has to be an emotion, and it's one word. So that's all you get to pick from. So that's how you create better ads, is focusing on what's the right emotion for this audience. And another interesting thing I'm totally going off question because I don't have a good answer for you. But an interesting thing about it is that, I lost my thought. There we go. Let's go to another question.
Okay, so you talked about the importance of emotion when it comes to sending emails and talking to people. So how do you change a negative emotion a negative experience or emotion somebody has towards your business or your brand and change it to a positive emotion so that way they stay with you?
Well, that's probably more of a PR question of how do you turn the tide more than a marketing message. But certainly the answer is give them more positive emotions and outweigh the negative emotion. And the easier answers to do that is find out what cachet do you have with them already? What are some positive experiences, even if it's minor, that you already have? And how can you build off that nostalgia or those past experiences to build better ones and erase the negative? Certainly if it was a really, really, really bad one, that's going to be really hard. But that's the best chance that you have, is to keep trying with good, positive ones. Okay.
First, just a quick, sorry about that. Quick comment, the God's honest truth is you won some instant credibility when you said the answer is both, because some of us have seen a lot of creative just for the sake of creative, which is neat if you're in that world, but not great if you're accountable for results. And the flip side is, like you said, just drone-like automation with results and no creativity. So thank you for the balance. But when it comes to timeline, there are executives that are all about results. I don't have 12 months for a content marketing campaign to mature. I don't have time for you to spend all my money branding and making people love us without any results. We don't all have Coca-Cola budgets where, animated polar bears with soft drinks are really cute. And so can you address a little bit of that sliding scale and moving from emotion to logic, moving through the funnel, higher end of the funnel, lower end, when you don't have a ton of time or when you do have time? I mean, what's the dance that you've seen play out between emotion and logic? Because at some point you got to pull the trigger.
Absolutely.
Right.
And what you're more asking is a question of timing and budget, is really what if I understand it. It's like, how do I get all those great experiences that you're talking about, but I don't have a lot of time and I don't have a lot of money? And my answer would be, then be very smart about what experiences you are going to create. If you only have social or online or whatever it may be, some digital experiences, and you don't have a lot of money for big media, that doesn't mean you can't connect with people. That doesn't mean you can't find the right emotions. So these ideas are independent of time and money. Do what's right, figure out great experiences. Remember when we talked about if it's a really, really strong emotion, it could be one exposure? Come up with one great exposure. There's no need to have the biggest budget. That's why I was joking at the beginning when I said, you either do it right or you have a massive budget. Certainly that's another option, but most of us don't have that option. So I would just go with the right experience for the customers at the right moment.
Got another question here?
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Yael. I'm a director of analytics. To explain the question, do you think there is room or we'll see more of measurement of emotions? Because if emotions have such a big impact, as a director of analytics, I would like to be able to measure them and loop them back into my logic circle.
Certainly. I don't know if any of you have gone to, there's an emotion booth down in our community pavilion, and that's an attempt of one company to try and harness and measure emotions. Certainly, I would hope that in the future, I can't predict that, but I would hope that there are better ways of us understanding that and predicting it. But even if you look at what the results are because of emotion, you can still have a straightforward message and an emotional message and see which one spikes higher, right? There are still ways with the tools we have today to figure out which messages are resonating. I can go do an A/B test online and see which of these two messages are going to resonate, and then go with the one that's the right emotion. And when I say the right emotion, sometimes people may look at an email subject line and say it's a straightforward message. But if you really go into, there's a term called context words. Context words are words that are already packed with emotion. They're built in. And there's an article that I think it may be on LinkedIn that I put out there. If not, I'll add it soon. But it's all about this study of understanding those context words and then making sure they're present when you're creating these headlines or emails or whatever it may be. So even though if something may be a logical sentence, as long as you have emotion in the right way, and that's why I'm saying emotion isn't just crazy, zany creativity like the other guy pointed out. It isn't. I'm not saying it's crazy creativity. I'm saying find the right experience for the right person at the right time. And that could be something that seems very logical, but it's packed with emotion because it's got those built-in context words. But to answer the measurement, there's a lot of different ways. I think you just have to do some testing, and hopefully the future, maybe around June, we'll get those that emotion measurement company going, and we can have a lot more data from that. That'd be fantastic. All right, we still have another one? Okay.
Just curious, what are your thoughts about your message having one strong emotion versus leaving your message with an open-ended emotional experience for the audience to have a variety of emotions related to your message?
That's a great question. And I would say depending on the experience, let's say it's a website where you're going to have a little more time on different pages, you certainly could spice up the different emotions. But what I always come back to is the rule of thumb of the bed of nails. If I lay on 1 million messages, even though they're all sharp, I could lay on it and nothing's going to penetrate. But if I'm on one nail, one message, one strong emotion, I'm certainly going to feel it. So that's just a classic marketing, advertising rule of thumb. If you have one emotion, go with it. The philosophy of restraint will help you get through more than trying to say, I'm Coca-Cola, I have all these fruity and wonderful flavors, drink all of them. Like, it's not going to stick. So I would stick with one first, and then as you have deeper experiences and they've gone further down the funnel, that's when you can layer on more. Okay?
Yeah, you've kind of already answered my question, but how would you personally score emotions, either negative or positive, to drive either conversion or engagement? Is that a question?
I think in my opinion, I think the positive emotion is exponentially more important than the negative one. If you have a couple negative emotions, that's not really going to help you out much. But as far as like a scale of how they relate to each other and how I can analyze those different emotions, I don't know if I have a good answer for that one. Oh, okay, the different types of emotion, how I would index which ones are more valuable than others. I haven't done a study on that. Like I said, the context word was an interesting one, and that was, they went through and analyzed different words that have different amounts of emotion packed into them. If you want to come up afterwards, I can give you a link to a site that it tries to analyze headlines and other things to try and find how much emotional cachet is in it. So I don't know the answer to every single word, but I would say there are certainly some that have a lot of emotion in them and some experiences that have very little emotion, and it would just be a matter of finding the right ones for your audience.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, maybe we got one more. One more zinger. Okay, there it is. I'm running out of answers, so this is it.
So obviously creating an emotion is going to give you a better brand connection. What do you think about the effectiveness of brands that try to leverage past positive emotions like nostalgia? So as an example, Arby's on social for the last 6 months has been taking their food and pairing it with pop culture elements or nostalgic things from people's childhood.
Absolutely. Nostalgia is very powerful, and I can't deny that it works. There are many instances where nostalgia works, and it's, again, going back because there's previous memory traces already laid down, and you're just tapping into those and slightly trying to twist them. Where I would say it's very important is being authentic. You know, you can see sometimes someone's jumped in on a catastrophe or something's happened and they're not authentic and it doesn't ring true, and suddenly they're trying to tap into that nostalgia and spin it, but it doesn't work and they've gone too far. That's what I would avoid. You need to, if you're going to tap into nostalgia or any other past experiences, just be very smart about it. And I would say don't try and go too far. Use enough of it that gets you there, but if you try and go too far, the radar will go off and people won't believe you. All right, well, I guess that's it. Thank you, everyone, for listening.